The Hodder Show podcast presents The Last Time I Went Trick or Treating. Written by TJ Hodder. Originally posted on the Dread Files Reddit account and No Sleep Reddit account. Not everyone remembers their final time going out trick-or-treating. People often say, one year it was fun and the next year it seemed lame. It's always up for debate at what age kids should stop trick-or-treating. Some people say 12 is too old, while others say that they don't mind if high school kids show up at their house, provided they're polite and respectful. My dad always thought the whole trick-or-treating thing was a little silly, but he was never against going with me when I was younger. That ended the year I turned 13, and it would turn out to be the last year I went trick-or-treating. Dad informed me earlier in the week that he wouldn't be going with me this year. He had to pull a double, and that if I insisted on going, he was fine with it. But that I needed to be careful and meet up with some friends. I was filled with nervous excitement. I never thought I'd be allowed to go out alone on my favorite holiday. Well, my former favorite holiday. The only problem with my dad's requirement was that, truth be told, I didn't have many friends. I never talked to my dad about it, but I was a loner at this point in my life. Sure, I had a few schoolyard chums, but we weren't really on the trick-or-treating together level of our friendship. So, against my better judgment, I lied to my dad and went solo. Vampires were all the rage this particular year. It seemed like every other kid at my school had plastic fangs, long black capes, and horrible Transylvanian accents. I want to suck your blood, blah! You know, those corny-ass Dracula voices. I, however, decided to go against the grain and dress up as my favorite monster, a werewolf. Dad spared no expense getting me a full-body costume with realistic fur and all. I even had a full face mask, if you can believe that. I was excited. This would be a night I'd remember forever. Little did I know how right I was about that. After Dad set out, I made a little map of all the houses I wanted to hit up for candy. My neighborhood was decent, but I heard rumors that houses on Stevenson Road gave out full-size candy bars. The holy grail for a kid on Halloween. Sure, the street was about a 20-minute walk, but I figured if I got through my neighborhood early enough, I'd be there and back before it got too late. Dad said he would call the house at 10 to make sure I was at home. If I wasn't there to answer, I'd be in trouble. A surprisingly crisp air blew past me, bringing the smell of candles, pumpkins, and sweets with it as I walked down the street to my first batch of houses. Kids were gallivanting around in sugar-induced hyperspells, parents desperately trying to keep up with them, and the occasional older sibling trying to convince their younger, more gullible sibling that a pack of raisins was a fair trade for a Snickers bar. I was overwhelmed with joy at the atmosphere around me. After about an hour, I was nearly done with my neighborhood, and the haul was sweet. My makeshift pillowcase bag was over halfway full, a sizable haul for me. It was 8 p.m., and I debated whether or not I even needed to go to Stevenson Road. After a brief inner monologue about this likely being my final year trick-or-treating and missing out on my last chance to get full-size candy bars, I began the trek out of my neighborhood. Once I made it to my destination, The reward was oh so sweet. Not only did all the houses have full-size candy bars, but they each gave me 2. My bag filled up pretty damn quickly after only another half hour. A few people asked me if I was alone. They seemed a little concerned, so I lied and said my dad was just down the road in his truck. Not sure why I lied. I guess I was afraid one of the more overzealous parents would want to go with me for the rest of the walk or even take me home. Couldn't have that happen until I hit every single house on the road. After the final house, I made my way back down the road as a few of the houses began to turn their porch lights off, cloaking the road in darkness. It was a little after 9 p.m. now, so as long as I made my way home, I'd be back in time for my dad's 10 p.m. check-in. If nothing else, Dad was always very punctual. And I now realize a part of him was likely still worried for me, even if he did think I was with friends. While I was making my way home, a cold wind blew past me, and it sent a chill down my spine and made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself this happened due to the cold, but walking back to my neighborhood on that dark road all by myself, I suddenly became frightened at my situation. I picked up the pace a little, yearning to see the streetlight at the beginning of the stretch of houses that made up my neighborhood. The sound of my heavy breathing and footsteps was the only noise I heard around me as I walked. Suddenly, a sound came from somewhere nearby. I could hear music. Not just any music, but Halloween music. I stopped and listened for a moment to determine where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from just ahead. Confused, scared, and a little curious, I jogged to see where the music was coming from. Just past the trees, I could see the glow of a porch light, and I made out an old gravel driveway. I stopped and looked upon a house that was done up with all manner of decorations, lights, and it even had a speaker playing the fantastical, creepy music. I was in absolute awe of the marvelous home before me. It took me a couple of minutes to realize that I didn't notice this house on my way to Stevenson Road. Surely I wouldn't have missed this spectacle as I walked this way. I chalked it up to the lights having been off, thinking maybe the owners of the house were late getting off work. Stranger things have happened. While I was thinking this over, I noticed a man sitting on the porch with a big bowl. We made eye contact, and he began to wave at me. At first to say hello, then to call me over. He was smiling and seemed nice enough. Just a normal older man in jeans and a rather ugly pumpkin-colored sweater. I looked at my watch. It was only 9:24 p.m. and I knew I was nearly home. Surely one more house wouldn't hurt. I walked down the gravel driveway to greet the man. Making my way up the steps to his porch, it creaked under the unexpected weight. The man stood up, setting the bowl down and using a cane to help support himself. He smiled as I held out my bag. "Trick or treat," I said warmly. "Oh my," he stated. "A wolf man? It's been a while since I've seen any of those. That's great," he said with a friendly chuckle. I was a little unsure of what to do next, so I laughed and responded, "Yeah, werewolves are my favorite," I said proudly. The man leaned in and whispered, "Can I tell you a secret? They're mine too," he said with a chuckle as he reached for his bowl, suddenly stopping. "Oh dear," he said defeated. "How did I run out of candy already with the late start I had? Guess I'll have to go grab some more from inside," he said as he began to slowly make his way to the door. He gripped the handle open with a loud creak. Stopping in the doorway, he turned to me. "Why don't you come inside for a sec, son? Get out of the cold while I fetch some more candy for you." Looking back at this moment as an adult, I now know how insane my next actions were. But I was just a kid. I was trusting. And the man had been nothing but kind to me. And living in a rural area, we were always taught to be polite. "Oh, sure, thank you, sir," I said as I followed the man inside. Walking past the threshold, I felt a chill go down my spine as the door shut behind me. I shivered as I looked around. There was nothing odd about the inside of his home. It was a little unkempt, but so was my dad and I's, so it didn't seem so strange to me. The man turned to me with a smile. "Why don't you have a seat? I'll just be a moment," he said, trailing off as he walked into another room. Sitting down on a chair, I waited for the man to bring me my goodies. As I sat looking around his home, I noticed a rather peculiar smell in the air. At first, I couldn't place it. Then after a few minutes, I determined that the smell reminded me of pennies. A strong smell of copper filled the air around me. But I was unsure what else smelled like that other than the now obsolete 1-cent coin. God, if only I had known, I would have run out of that fucking house right then and there. I sat for what felt like an eternity while I heard the man shuffling around in the other room. After a while, I heard the man yell from the room that he was in. "You think you could come help me for a second? I can't seem to find where I put my damn cane," he shouted, clearly frustrated. I let out a sigh and stood up, walking towards the room his voice was coming from. Walking down the hall, the smell was getting stronger. It was almost unbearable. With the final step, I turned into the room the man's voice was coming from. And as I stepped into the room, I looked down at my watch and noticed the time still read 9:24 p.m. I started to think that maybe my battery was dying. I heard a weird squishing sound as I walked, and I looked down at my feet. Covering my shoes was a sticky, thick layer of blood. I had never seen so much blood before, aside from a small cut here or there, but I knew what it looked like. And there was so much of it, all over the floor and my shoes. I felt my skin grow pale and a cold sweat hit me as I slowly lifted my head. The sight that met my 13-year-old self was indescribable, but I will do my best to explain it. Hanging from the blood-soaked ceiling by large hooks were dozens of mutilated corpses. Their flesh had been torn away in strips, and there were large bite marks in some spots on their bodies. Blood was still oozing from several of them into a puddle on the floor. There were children, teenagers, and adults, all dead, all with the majority of their flesh missing. A couple of them were even missing their eyes. God, the way those eyeless corpses looked, their mouths wide open as if in a silent scream, capturing their final moments of life in horrifying pain. I was too scared to make a sound and too sick to my stomach to even throw up. I took several steps back as I began to hyperventilate, fear beginning to take over. Suddenly, I bumped into something, and I felt a strong hand rest on my shoulder. I nearly screamed as I slowly looked up to see the once kind-looking old man smiling down at me. He had blood all over his face and bits of flesh in his teeth. His eyes were now pure black, and he didn't need his cane to support his weight. I was horrified. Tears began to fill my eyes as the man opened his mouth impossibly wide, ready to take a bite out of me. I tried to run, but his grip was too strong. It was as if I was being held in place by chains. I closed my eyes, hoping it would be over quickly, wishing at that moment that I had just stayed home, or that my dad could have come with me. Suddenly, I heard a weak, gurgling yell come from the room behind us. It yelled. I opened my eyes and looked to see that one of the bodies hanging from the ceiling was trying to free himself and making as much noise as possible. More skin tore from his back as he wiggled to get loose from the hooks embedded in him. He yelled again, this time with such force as if any life he had left was being used to make the sound. I looked up at the old man, who was looking over at him, distracted, and his grip loosening as he debated on going over to the man who was now taunting him. This was my only chance. I ran faster than I ever had before. I made it to the door and flung it open. I threw myself out, but felt something grip my lower leg, falling on the porch. I looked back to see the old man had slipped on the blood chasing after me, covering him in head to toe. His mouth was growing even larger as he let out a demonic bellowing screech. With tears in my eyes, I kicked again and again and again until I finally hit him in the eye, which caused him to recoil. I threw myself off the porch, got up and ran down the driveway. I didn't stop running until I reached my driveway. By the time I had arrived, my father was in the driveway, seemingly ready to get in his truck to come find me. He began to yell, but I just ran to him and hugged him. I was crying and wailing in fear. It caught him off guard, and any anger he had for me missing my curfew by almost 2 hours seemed to vanish. He took me inside and looked me over. The fur of my costume was covered in blood. He tore it off me and looked me over, tending to a large scratch on my leg. After comforting me, he asked me to tell him what happened. I could barely form words, but I managed to get out that a man down the road did this and had real dead bodies in his house, that he tried to eat me. The real blood all over my costume was evidence enough for my dad to call the police. They investigated the area over the next couple of hours. The next morning, a rather annoyed police officer asked me some generic questions. It seemed that they had looked up and down the road all night for this so-called house, but couldn't find it. They had me show them where it was, but it was gone. I couldn't explain it. I knew what I experienced was real. I had the bloody costume and the scratch marks on my leg to prove it. The police chalked it up to a prank gone a little too far and called off the search. My dad never doubted me, but there was only so much he could do. Sometimes at night, he'd drive up and down the road looking for the mysterious house, but he never found anything. He spent years trying to find it, or the man I described. He would never forgive himself for not being there with me that night. Although, I'm not sure if things would have been different if he had been. Maybe we would be traumatized together, or much worse. Halloween was never the same for me, even after seeing several therapists. The idea of leaving the safety of my home on that night, or most nights for that matter, seems impossible. Now, all these years later, I still think about that night a lot. What was that house? What was the creature inside of it? Does it only come out on Halloween? I'll never have any answers. But most of all, I think about that man who saved my life. Was likely a parent to a child who just wanted to go trick-or-treating and thought the house looked like a good stop. They were lured in like a moth to a flame by all the mesmerizing lights and decorations. However, even though the pain must have been unbearable, the man saw that the creature was about to kill another child and wouldn't stand for it. A final act of defiance and courage saved my young life. He was a hero. My hero. I just wish I could thank him. Or even better, that I could have saved him. Survivor's guilt is a hell of a thing to live with. So that's it. That is the last time I ever went trick-or-treating. The only thing I have left to say to you is this. If you're walking down a dark road on Halloween night and you come across a marvelously decorated house and a nice old man, run. This has been the last time I ever went trick-or-treating. Written by TJ Hodder. Originally posted on the Dread Files Reddit account and the No Sleep Reddit account. The narration was performed by TJ Hodder. Original music for this episode was provided by Mason Desroches. Any additional music or sound effects heard were provided on a royalty-free basis, and credit is given in the description of this episode. This episode and the story may not be rebroadcasted in any way without the express written consent of the Hodder Show podcast or TJ Hodder. I would like to express a special thank you to all of my Patreon supporters over on the Hodder Show Patreon. Ronan Kumori, Wolf Delta Pi, Eric Phones, Mike Quintero, C.M. Peters, Jason Reese, Terry and Janet Hodder, Brandon Bowden, Neil Skarupa, and Ian Hall. Thank you all for the support. It means the world to me. And thank you, listener, for experiencing this story with me and for being a part of the long-standing tradition here on The Hodder Show of doing some horror narration on Halloween. Stay tuned for next week, as I have something a little different planned, but I think you're really going to enjoy it. And if you enjoyed this narration, stay tuned on all of the Hodder Show social media accounts, because next year, something is coming, and 2024 will be the year of horror.